It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, May 31st, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey. Biden endorses Gaza ceasefire proposal. North Korean balloons rain filth down on South Korea. We have an inflation report, and South Africa is voting. Let us begin with the inflation report. Today, Dateline... Well, actually, I don't know the dateline, but it's Reuters. U.S. inflation tracked sideways in April, and consumer spending weakened. Reuters says mixed signals for the Federal Reserve that provided little clarity on whether the U.S. central bank will be able to begin cutting interest rates in September. Consumer spending, which accounts for more than two-thirds of U.S. economic activity, increased by 0.2% in April. That is down from the 0.7% rise in March. What do we think, Sam Park?
Well, when they say it moving sideways, I think that's exactly right. It's inflation is essentially holding steady, and I would say that the longer it does so, the less likely it is that there will be an interest rate cut this year. And I can't imagine why it would not continue to move sideways. There would have to be some really marked decrease in consumer spending, especially for that to occur. And it eludes me why that might happen. One thing I would say, though, is that this is the second month in a row that I can recall that the inflation report came in very much in line with what experts had predicted. So, as we said before, that's pretty good news in that people aren't constantly being surprised anymore about what's going on in the American economy. But inflation is just going to continue to be a problem. I think that really sums it up the best that I could ever think to do. And I think it's important to remember also that inflation, for instance, there's all this talk still about how well the American economy is doing on a sort of top line level. The sort of GDP numbers, employment, and things like that. And those are important figures. But why do Americans still think the economy is so bad? And I think part of it is that inflation acts in very much the same way as a regressive tax.
Right.
That is, it has more impact on you the further down the wealth and income tables that you are. And as we've talked about before, when things like food, energy, housing, and insurance, right? The things you just have to pay no
Mandatory.
matter what. Yeah.
Not discretionary.
When those things are very expensive, if you're not a person of substantial means, it hurts. And so I think it's not that people don't understand how good the economy is. It's that economic commentators, I think in general, are people of enough means that they're not hurting. All right. And so they don't understand why other people are so exercised about this. That's just my theory, mind you. I don't expect that next month's report is going to be all that different, frankly.
Okay. New York Times, quoting Joe Biden. At this point, Hamas is no longer capable of carrying out another October 7th, end of quote. The U.S. president said from the White House today, it's time for the war to end and for the day after to begin. He was speaking from the state dining room. Biden essentially endorsed an Israeli proposal that has been transmitted to Hamas via Qatari negotiators. This is New York Times reporting. Biden says the proposal would be broken into three phases. The first is a 6-week ceasefire, so you have an armistice. The withdrawal of Israeli forces from populated areas of Gaza, which is essentially all of Gaza, and the exchange of elderly and women hostages by Hamas in exchange for the release of hundreds of Palestinian detainees. And Biden says, quote, this is truly a decisive moment. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove whether they really mean it, end of quote. If he pulls this off, Biden has pulled off something really quite advanced. Somehow, he maintained his stalwart support of Israel, but he's still going to be the peacemaker here.
If he pulls it off. Yes, that's right.
If he pulls it off.
Yeah.
And also, if Hamas doesn't do this ceasefire, I think it starts to become challenging even for the most left to kind of I suppose it just gets harder to then demonize Israel, right? If Hamas doesn't take this seriously.
I think the most left can demonize Israel
Fine.
just,
Okay.
while they're brushing their teeth.
That's a fair point. But you see my point. It kind of
Yes,
it starts to edify, or it starts to kind of back up an Israeli perspective if Hamas blows this.
honestly, I thought that Biden's remarks, which I would encourage everybody to go and watch the YouTube clip, it was one of the more skillful public statements I can recall seeing him make. And as you pointed out, I think very astutely, when he mentioned that Hamas no longer has the capability to carry out another attack like that of October 7th, that was very important.
I totally agree, because nobody has framed the purpose of the war that specifically, to the best of my knowledge.
No, I think that's right. It was certainly more specific than the way people generally talk about things.
Yeah,
like
eradicate
that.
Hamas.
Yeah.
That's kind of fuzzy.
Yeah, and certainly not anybody on President Biden's level, right? That is, in terms of the influence and impact potentially of his remarks. He also made a point of saying that he understood that people inside the Israeli government would not be supportive of this proposal. And I don't recall him actually mentioning people like that in any of his public remarks of the war so far. And that's been a very big problem that I don't think has gotten quite as much attention as it deserves. Some of the far right elements of the coalition government that backs Prime Minister Netanyahu are just the worst sort of extremists that you can imagine. And they routinely say things like from the river to the sea. They routinely say things like they would like to reoccupy Gaza and somehow expel the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. And so, in fact, the more unlivable Gaza becomes with each passing day, the more those people are actually getting their way. And they're pretty much the only ones who are. They're the only ones for whom this is working out on any level.
And thus not incentivized to end it.
Yes, they, if anything, they might be upset that that the destruction, the pace of destruction has actually been scaled back to some extent over the months. That is recently. And Biden also mentioned the vital need to dramatically increase the amount of aid flowing into Gaza, far beyond what's actually happening now, which is, of course, that is something that has been widely discussed, I'm happy to say. But in terms of the length of his statement, which I thought was pretty much perfect, it was about close to 15 minutes in which he discussed all of these matters, and then he just left without taking any questions. Now, mind you, the first minute was him talking about the guilty verdict against Donald Trump yesterday, which I thought he actually navigated that very skillfully too. But the overwhelming bulk of his remarks today were about the situation in Gaza. Now, it's possible that this will come to nothing, that Hamas will just say no, right? They've done it several times already. And we might think that they see the ongoing carnage and destruction of Gaza as actually being in their interest. I think that's actually a pretty fair characterization. But as you say, if he does pull this off, it will be a remarkable achievement. I don't know if he'll actually get any credit for it from anybody, but it would be really something to think about.
Just in the way he has managed to very skillfully, acknowledge the left and the progressives, and he has ratcheted up his criticism of how Israel has prosecuted this war, but at the same time has done nothing policy-wise or rhetorically that would change the longstanding partnership between the United States and Israel, and in particular for the defense of Israel. Pretty skillful.
Okay, but it's not as though he hasn't had his share of missteps that have been
Of
significant. For
course.
example, we had the episode a couple of weeks ago, which we discussed, where, okay, we're not going to send the giant 2,000 pound or 500 pound bombs, right? But that didn't actually stop, the Israelis from going into Rafah, which the United States has said over and over again that they would prefer not to happen. But then the Israelis go right ahead and do it, and the response from the United States is very muted. And so it's in that respect, it really does seem as though Israel can just continue to thumb its nose at the United States, its chief benefactor. And so, yeah, mind you, this is a very difficult thing. I think this is the most difficult task of anything confronting Joe Biden right now, when he doesn't lack for difficult tasks. But it's not as if there haven't been mistakes.
Sure.
And I think, while we're patting him on the back, we should make sure we keep an accurate tally of the things that he might have done better. Because I think he should, honestly, and just in general, I think he should have perhaps attempted to rein in Israel sooner and more forcefully. I think in general that would be a very fair criticism. And it's great that he's doing these things now. I would have to agree with people who say that he might have done this sooner, frankly.
Okay, I have one more question on this, and then we'll move on to South Africa. What if Hamas just doesn't go for it?
Oh, I think that's very likely.
Like, what are we supposed to do then? Like, you have apparently a good faith effort by Israel, endorsed by the United States, for a ceasefire. Like, how do you make peace with an enemy that won't make peace, that just wants carnage and destruction?
It's a fair question.
Like, how's Israel supposed to win the PR war? Right? Like, oh, well, they won't make peace. Let's be more careful about this. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I understand that. I don't think that the Israelis are necessarily thinking about it in those terms. And you're right. It is a real conundrum, but you have to, I believe, constantly be seen to making an effort. And in a way, as much as Biden does seem to be ratcheting up the pressure on Israel here, he's also, again, sort of skillfully trying to give them an out, right? Saying, look, support this, right? How can, for instance, if Hamas doesn't support it, what do you expect, right? I mean, they're insane religious fanatics, right? But if Israel can't support it, then who's the fanatic, right? And so it was important that he urged both sides to back this, because he demonstrates that he understands that either side could tank it. And so just because Israel has proposed this doesn't mean everybody in Israel is on board with this. Netanyahu is under lots of pressure from all aspects of his own cabinet. You've got people like Benny Gantz, Yoav Gallant. Gallant is in Netanyahu's own party, and they're pressuring him, saying, you've got to come up with a better plan for what we're going to be doing here, because we can't be asking our military to keep going in for something that they have no idea how this will end for them. And so, look, this is a terrible conundrum, right? This is a situation that has eluded policymakers for decades.
Right.
I applaud President Biden for taking a really good shot at this one. But we'll have to see how it works out. This could all be over today, right? Sure. Hamas could come out today and say, no, we're not doing it.
Right.
We'll see.
To the elections in South Africa, which began on the 29th, so a couple of days ago. Not all the votes have been counted.
70% was the last I saw.
I saw 80%,
okay.
And which is still not 100%. And so let's just give a little background on this. The ANC, right? The African National Congress, that is Nelson Mandela's party, has held power since 1994. That is the start of post-apartheid South Africa. So that's kind of the That's the line in the rings of the tree, right? Like it's apartheid 94 ends, first post-apartheid election in 94. And it's Nelson Mandela, who, of course, is one of the charismatic political leaders of the entire 20th century, and his party lead South Africa in this post-apartheid democracy. Well, the ANC is losing ground. They're running out of steam. There was an election in 2021. It was the first time since 1994 that the ANC didn't win a majority. They have lost support in big cities like Johannesburg and Durban and others. And in August of last year, a pre-election agreement called the Multi-Party Charter was signed by a bunch of parties, not the ANC, the Democratic Alliance, the IFP, the Freedom Front Plus. I thought you might like that one, Sam, FF Plus, and a bunch of other ones, to present a united front against the 3-decade rule of the African National Congress Party. I'm getting this from Wikipedia. And then there's also this kind of, I don't know if it's rogue, but there's this Economic Freedom Fighters Party that is South African communist and black nationalist and founded by a youth leader in the ANC who had been expelled.
That's right. Yeah.
So you've got
Julius
the ANC.
Malema.
Right. So you've got the ANC that's been in power forever, kind of the one party rule. You've got African black nationalist communists, and then you've got this big multi-party charter trying to defeat both of them. Have I framed that correctly?
Yes. I would say, though, that
it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. The economic freedom fighters, for instance, you described them as black nationalist communists. There was a time when you could, before the end of apartheid, back in about, I would say about the 70s or so, you could describe the entire ANC that way, right? They were a client of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And since coming to power, they've, Mandela famously abandoned violence as a strategy, and to his credit, I would say. But since becoming the incumbent party, they've become very much the status quo party, which you would expect would happen, if you're the one party that's governing for 3 decades, right? And so, to the extent that people are upset with the status quo, which they very much are, it shouldn't be any surprise that the ANC has declined in support. And the economic freedom fighters were formerly just a wing of the ANC, as you point out. There's also the rise of the MK party under the leadership of former president Jacob Zuma, right? Who was the immediate predecessor of the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and was ousted as president because of many different criminal charges. And he's still, in fact, barred from sitting in parliament because of a conviction for contempt of court. Some of his other charges were overturned. But what with the Summer Olympics coming up, I've thought for quite a long time that political corruption should be an Olympic sport.
It really ought to.
Because every nation can compete.
Yeah, everybody can field a team.
That's right. It would be no problem. But also, the International Olympic Committee is itself such a very deeply corrupt institution that they could easily field a panel of judges from within their own ranks. And we wouldn't have to rely on sort of NGOs like Transparency International and the like to let us know who's corrupt. Right? It would just be understood going into the Olympics that that's the category, right? Political corruption. And these expert judges from the IOC could sort of award medals on the basis of, innovation in the field of corruption, right? What sort of shell companies are you forming and things like this, right? There's sort of style points. And
it'd be more like figure skating and less like track.
Yes. But the point of bringing this up is that, again, very competitive sport, right? But if it had been a competitive sport, then Jacob Zuma would almost certainly have been a medalist anyway. He might not have gotten the gold, all right, but he would have been something that the TV commentators would have been watching very carefully. just the level of corruption that took place under Jacob Zuma's presidency was unbelievable. And Cyril Ramaphosa, his successor, came to power promising to bring an end to the widespread political corruption inside of South Africa. And I don't think people think he's done a very good job.
I mean, isn't that a hard claim to make if you're still running as a member of the ruling party?
Yes, it is, right? But you know, he certainly didn't have a choice about whether or not to run that way. People understood what a problem it was, and they weren't going to take no for an answer in a certain sense. But for instance, I read an article in The Economist a couple weeks ago leading up to the election, and I think in our country we would call it a political action committee, but anyway, it's called Chancellor House, which is the name or was the name of Nelson Mandela's former law firm before he went to prison. And Chancellor House funds the ANC, and the bulk, and not just funds it, but up to about half of the ANC's funding seems to come from this one organization. And their main source of funding is part ownership of a manganese mine, which is also partly owned by Russian mining interests.
Wait. So the ruling party gets the majority of its funding,
up perhaps as much as a majority,
at least half, or a big chunk,
up to half, about
a
half,
big
maybe.
chunk of its funding from a non-governmental entity that gets its revenue from a manganese mine that is run by the Russians?
Partly, yeah. It's all their Chancellor House owns part of the mine, and so does a Russian mining firm. And mind you, this is
where there's smoke, there's fire, man.
Okay, but fine. I mean, how much dark money is there in our political system?
No, totally.
Right? At least this is something that has been reported on and we can find out about, right? But yet the point is that Cyril Ramaphosa certainly has not ended corruption in the ANC. Sure. But just to cut to the chase, first of all, the results that we've seen so far are very much in line with the pre-election polling that we saw going into the election.
The ANC is not going to win a majority.
That's right. And the percentage that they're receiving, seemingly about 47%, is pretty much where the polls had them. And there's been some irregularities in voting here and there, as there are in just about every election. But there's no real indication of any sort of rigging or anything like that. This really does appear to be a free and fair election on the whole. And that's something that we can't take for granted in many different parts of the world, as we've discussed. And so in that sense, we should cheer ourselves about the results of this election. But we're going to have to see with whom the ANC can form a coalition government, because they're going to be one of the parties in government without a doubt. No other party is anywhere near their vote share of 47%. It's ironic, though, that if Jacob Zuma because his party, the MK, seems to be polling at about 12% or so. Had he not made a point of breaking with the ANC very publicly, it's possible that the ANC might have been able to retain their parliamentary majority instead of having to form a coalition government. It seems as though they could partner with any of the largest three parties that have campaigned against them. It could be the MK, it could be the Economic Freedom Fighters, it could be the Democratic Alliance, which is the largest opposition party, who are actually...
They're part of that multi-party chart of the DA.
That's right. The
MK is not, the Economic Freedom Fighters are not, and also the Patriotic Alliance not part of that multi-party chart.
That's right. And the Democratic Alliance are the sort of political descendants of the white apartheid era liberal parties who stood against the apartheid regime in
I'm
the
sorry.
South African parliament at the time.
Oh, there was a white liberal anti-apartheid party.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
But they just never won elections in apartheid era
Sure.
South Africa.
Right. Um, just real quick, South Africa is a country of 62 million people. Its GDP is like 38th. So it's important. It's a big country. And especially right now with what's going on with the Houthis in the Red Sea, its importance to global shipping lanes has become paramount in the last, 6 to 10 months. So
yes, I still have heard
South Africa has always been important. You look back in the history of, the British Empire or whatever, like it's always been important. It's really important now.
That's right. And they routinely contest with Nigeria for the largest economy on the African continent, or at least in sub-Saharan Africa. They are an important country. They're in the BRICS grouping, as we say. I still haven't heard any news about possible port expansion, which you'd think that someone would have gotten off on the stick about so far, because that situation of shipping not being able to go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, that hasn't cleared up, right? South Africa should be trying to expand their port capacity, because I don't think that situation is going to end anytime soon. I suppose, given the peace plan, maybe they expect something might happen. They don't want to invest a lot in ports and then not be able to use them. All right.
But I'll tell you what, Sam, even if the Suez Canal opened right back up tomorrow, somebody somewhere who had to make a stop in South Africa is going to say, you know what? We got a great deal on this. The port was easier to deal with. Some shipping company somewhere is going to hear from some captain who said, oh, yeah, it was more efficient to go to South Africa.
I would think that's true.
There's, it's market. Like things happen. Oh, I liked working with this person, whatever, this vendor. So, yeah, it is surprising.
That's true, John. But if you combine,
look, I have seen a map,
Yeah, but if you combine what you and I know about
international shipping,
maritime shipping, then and you add that to like a couple bucks, then that'll get you a cup of coffee. We'll have to see what sort of coalition government will be formed. It could be very awkward for the African National Congress, because they've never had to do anything like this before. They've been ruling by themselves. And it just goes to show you, it doesn't matter. We all have an incredible amount of admiration for Nelson Mandela, right? But one party rule is a recipe for corruption. It doesn't matter what kind of party it is or what its history is. It's just almost always going to work out that way.
Look, you can look through the history of the United States in the last 100 years. There was effectively one party rule, for example, in the U.S. South until the 60s, right?
That's right.
That was corrupt and bad.
Yeah, I mean, and it's going to work out that way anywhere you go. So we shouldn't be surprised about it if it happens in any country in the world.
Before we move off South Africa, I want to put up the Economic Freedom Fighters logo. Which way? This right here. We'll put it up here.
Okay.
I mean, it's great. It's pan-African nationalist. It's black nationalism. So you got a black fist. You've got the red spear. You've got the green continent of Africa with a single star in it. It's just like,
it's very retro. Yeah.
It's just ticks so many boxes. Like, it would be in poor taste for, a white capitalist like me in California to wear Economic Freedom Fighters swag or logos, right?
Yes.
But like, it's a cool T-shirt.
I would agree.
Right? Like, it's got the Che factor, right?
Sure. I mean, and the thing is, I think honestly, style points have a lot to do with politics all the time, right? I mean,
always.
Having a good logo or a charismatic leader and things like this, there's just, and it doesn't matter whether you're from the left or the right? These things also work out because people are just human beings, right? They respond to things like this.
Yeah, I mean, even something as dumb as MAGA, right? That's just a punchy little acronym.
Are you kidding me? Yeah. I mean,
punchy little acronym. People like it. Sure.
You could alter that Economic Freedom Fighters logo very slightly, right? Yeah. And just substitute this element for that element, right? And it could be a MAGA logo. It wouldn't take much at all.
Let's pivot to the always entertaining rivalry between North and South Korea. Well, it's Faulkner, right, who says the past isn't dead, it isn't even past.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So North Korea and South Korea, the Korean Peninsula is divided and demilitarized, where the end of the Korean War was, uh, where hostilities ended. There's been no peace treaty in the Korean War since 1953.
Okay, the peninsula is not demilitarized. There's a
No,
demilitarized zone
yeah,
separating them.
what,
Yeah.
38th parallel?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and there's decades of like both Koreas playing recorded messages at one another and dropping leaflets from balloons, right? Just like petty, but like kind of crappy behavior towards the other side, right? And
Yes.
I'm not defending, or I'm certainly don't mean to criticize South Korea in a broad brush the way I would North Korea. Two very different governments and ways of life. But North Korea has now, let me find the reporting here. North Korea, Dateline Seoul from the Associated Press, manure, cigarette butts, scraps of cloth, waste batteries, even reportedly diapers. This week, North Korea floated hundreds of huge balloons to dump all of that trash across rival South Korea, an old-fashioned Cold War style provocation that the country has rarely used in recent years. Now, I don't know the AP reporter, but that's good writing. That's a good lead.
I would agree.
Manure, cigarette
yes.
butts.
Now, just to place this
balloons full of rubbish sent over the demilitarized zone.
Just to place this in context, right? This was partly in response to South Korea sending balloons over that contained things like leaflets, USB drives and leaflets, right? To try and wage a propaganda war against North Korea. Also, the North.
It's like Radio Free Europe from a balloon.
That's right. The North has also launched some short-range ballistic missiles against the South, which happens with depressing regularity.
They against the South, can you clarify that? They haven't launched a missile at South Korea, right?
Yes, they have. It's just that they've been intercepted,
okay.
Right? And again, that's not all that unusual, right? It's sort of like the rocket fired from Lebanon into Israel and vice versa, right? These things happen somewhat routinely, I'm sorry to say. The North also tried to launch a spy satellite about a week ago, but it blew up on its way up into orbit. And so it just seems that, okay, well, what else have we got? Poop balloons, apparently, is where you go with this.
Poop balloons, exactly. Like North Korea is a nuclear-armed, totalitarian communist state that is aggressive, if not outright belligerent. I think we are not well served, although understandably misled by their kind of cartoonish buffoonery.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Down to their leadership.
But what are you supposed to do? I mean, it's a poop balloon.
They're buffoons. And
but they are exceedingly dangerous. But it just reinforces the pattern that we've talked about before, where the 21st century seems like a really, really bad Hollywood reboot of the 20th century.
I know.
Where in the First World War, you have these great August Zeppelins moving majestically through the sky, right? That was, serious air power back then. What do we got now? Poop balloons. I mean, it's just absurd. This isn't stupid.
Just balloons in general. Not even the first time we've discussed it on Working for Crusoe.
Balloon Gate from last year. It just is so dumb. But yeah, that's where we are, unfortunately. But one thing I would say about this is that, as we mentioned, the peninsula was divided in 1948, right? Since then, South Korea, a U.S. ally, and now a full-fledged, vibrant democracy, has lived right next door to a country that has endlessly vowed to destroy them and now has nuclear weapons.
As well as thousands of cannons poised to rain down deadly artillery on like millions of South Koreans at a stroke of a command.
That's right. And still, South Korea just keeps on going as a stable, prosperous country.
They have baseball leagues and everything.
That's right. If they can do that since 1948, other countries can do it too.
It is just, whenever we talk about North Korea, it is fascinating how little attention the Korean War gets.
I agree with that. Yeah.
That was really hot World War III almost happening 5 short years after the Second World War ended. I mean, that almost got real hot and nuclear real quick. And it's never ended. They just had a ceasefire.
That's right.
They demilitarized a zone at the 38th parallel.
Technically still in a state of war.
It's still on the boil, right? It's just simmering. So that's a nice thought for your weekend.
Happy Poop Balloon Day, everybody.
Yeah, right. Yes. As we bid adieu to May, we'll always have poop balloons. Right. Next week, we will follow up on what we anticipate will be the final results, the official results of the South African election, and Mexico is voting.
Yes, and we should get final results from the elections in India. So between
world's largest democracy.
That's right. Among all those elections, we should have a pretty full plate next week. And then the week after that, we'll have the European Union elections. So Electorama 2024 is really moving into peak phase right now. So that'll be a very full plate next week and probably the week after also.
All right. If you have questions or comments, hit us on the email, johnrameymedia@gmail.com, or Sam Park. I am John Ramey. This has been Working for Crusoe. Have yourselves a great weekend.
Thanks, folks.